Luxury car dealer laughs at black millionaire, but quickly turns pale when they learn who her son is. The glittering facade of Elite Motors promised exclusivity, but inside a quiet storm was brewing. Victoria Bennett, draped in a crimson silk gown, had come to claim the car of her dreams, a sleek Aston Martin Vantage. Yet the smug owner, Blake Thompson, dismissed her with veiled disdain, assuming she couldn't afford such a luxury. Little did he know, the woman he humiliated was not just a self-made millionaire, but the mother of Marcus Bennett, a powerful businessman with the means to dismantle his empire. What happens next will leave you speechless. But before diving into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another one. Elite Motors sparkled like a temple of opulence under the golden afternoon sun, its glass walls reflecting the wealth it promised to those who could afford it. Inside, each vehicle gleamed under the soft glow of strategically placed spotlights, their polished curbs begging to be admired. At the center of the showroom sat the silver Aston Martin Vantage, its sleek design exuding power and sophistication. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement, a symbol of success, and for most, an unattainable dream. Victoria Bennett, a woman in her early 50s, stood at the entrance, her crimson silk gown catching the light like a flame in the otherwise monochromatic space. A successful entrepreneur in the luxury travel industry, Victoria was no stranger to rooms like this, where money spoke louder than words. Her boutique travel company, Bennett Escapes, catered to high-net-worth clients, crafting bespoke experiences that whispered exclusivity and elegance. Despite her accomplishments, she often found herself navigating rooms where her presence was met with skepticism, or worse, disdain. She stepped forward, her heels clicking against the showroom's pristine tiles, each step deliberate and confident. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, scanned the space until they landed on the Aston Martin. A faint smile played on her lips. This was the car she wanted. Not as a trophy, but as a celebration of her journey. A testament to the battle she'd fought and won, in business and in life. Across the room, Blake Thompson, the owner of Elite Motors, leaned casually against the counter, mid-conversation with two well-dressed clients. His tailored navy suit hugged his frame, an image of wealth and authority. His laughter, loud and deliberate, carried across the room, drawing attention to his presence. Blake had built his reputation as the go-to dealer for the ultra-rich, a man who could open doors to the most exclusive automotive treasures, but he was also known for his unspoken rule. His showroom catered to a certain type of clientele. Blake's eyes flicked toward the entrance as Victoria stepped inside. The subtle narrowing of his gaze betrayed his irritation, though he quickly masked it with a practiced smile. He turned back to his clients, continuing his conversation as if nothing had changed. To him, Victoria's presence was an anomaly, one he wasn't inclined to acknowledge. Victoria approached the Aston Martin, her fingers brushing lightly against its flawless surface. The cool metal was a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin, grounding her amidst the hum of distant chatter. She circled the car, her gaze lingering on its every detail. The streamlined curves, the meticulously crafted interior visible through the glass. She had done her research. She knew that this car was more than a luxury. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a vehicle that married form and function in a way few others could. Her reverie was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned to see Blake striding toward her, his expression carefully neutral, but his body language betraying his unease. He stopped a few feet away, maintaining a calculated distance that felt more like a barrier than a courtesy. "Admiring the Vantage, I see," Blake said, his tone polished but with an undercurrent of condescension. "It's quite a beauty." Victoria met his gaze, unflinching. "It is. I'd like to know more about this model." Blake's smile tightened. "Of course. Though I should mention this particular vehicle is exclusive. Perhaps you'd prefer to browse our pre-owned inventory across town." The words landed like a slap, their meaning clear. Victoria's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. She had faced this kind of subtle dismissal before, too many times to count, yet each instant stung with the same sharpness. "Actually," she said, her voice steady and measured, "I've done my research. I know exactly what I'm looking for, and it's this car." Blake let out a short laugh, more derisive than amused. "I'm sure you understand, Ms. Bennett, Victoria Bennett." "Ms. Bennett," he continued, his tone dripping with polite disdain, "this car costs more than most people earn in a decade. I wouldn't want to waste your time." The hum of conversation in the showroom seemed to quiet, the tension thickening as Blake's words hung in the air. Nearby, a young salesperson, James, glanced over, his discomfort evident. He hesitated, his gaze shifting between Blake and Victoria, as if unsure whether to intervene. Victoria tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "And what exactly makes you think I can't afford it? My gender? My skin color? Or perhaps both?" Blake's smile froze, faltering for the briefest moment before he regained his composure. "Not at all, ma'am," he said, his voice colder now. "It's just that we cater to a very specific clientele here. I'm sure you understand." James took a step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak, but Blake raised a hand, silencing him before he could utter a word. "It's fine, James," Blake said without looking at him. "I'll handle this." The exchange had drawn the attention of other customers, their whispers creating a low hum that filled the air. Victoria felt their eyes on her, some curious, others judgmental. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag, but her voice remained calm. "I'd like to speak to the owner," she said. Blake stepped closer, his towering frame meant to intimidate. "You're looking at him, and if you don't leave now, I'll have to ask security to escort you out." Victoria's heart pounded, anger bubbling beneath her composed exterior, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she stood taller, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice low but firm. "And if you think I'm leaving without addressing this blatant discrimination, you're sorely mistaken." Blake's face darkened. With a quick motion, he gestured to a pair of security guards hovering near the entrance. "Escort her out," he said, his voice sharp. As the guards approached, Victoria's breath hitched, her pulse racing, but she held her ground, her dignity intact even as the room seemed to close in around her. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of judgment and curiosity. And then, like a storm brewing on the horizon, the sound of sirens filled the air. "It's okay, Doctor," Mason said softly, then grabbed Stacy by the arm. Victoria's fingers lingered on the sleek curve of the Aston Martin's hood, tracing the line as if memorizing its shape. The tension in the room was palpable now, the hum of distant conversations fading into an almost oppressive quiet. Her calm exterior was a mask, but inside, a fire was building, slow and deliberate, like embers catching a breeze. She turned to face Blake fully, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the stillness, "I'm here for this model. I've read up on its specs and customization options." Blake's chuckle was brief but loud enough to ensure nearby customers heard it. He shifted his weight, his polished loafers squeaking faintly against the floor. It was a sound of confidence, though his smile carried an edge of mockery. "Ma'am," he began, emphasizing the word in a tone that bordered on patronizing, "this car costs more than most people earn in a decade. I wouldn't want to waste your time." A murmur spread through the showroom, the subtle reaction of onlookers who couldn't quite decide if they should watch or turn away. Victoria's lips tightened slightly, but she didn't flinch. Her voice, when she responded, was as measured as ever, though now it carried a pointed edge. "Don't concern yourself with my time," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Just give me the details I asked for." Blake's expression hardened, his forced smile slipping. He glanced briefly at James, the younger salesman standing awkwardly nearby, as if daring him to intervene. James shifted his weight uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Blake and Victoria, but he said nothing. The silence stretched, thickening the air between them. Blake finally sighed, as though indulging a persistent child. He gestured toward the Aston Martin with a lazy wave of his hand. "Fine," he said. "It's the latest Finches. V8 engine, twin-turbo, 503 horsepower, top speed 195 miles per hour. But you probably already read that in one of those glossy brochures." His eyes flicked over her gown, his tone laced with derision. Of course, performance specs aren't usually what interests casual admirers. Victoria didn't miss the implication. Her lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're right," she said evenly. "I'm more interested in the handling. How does it compare to the DB11 under tight cornering?" Depression creased Victoria's features, perhaps from training or other causes. The question seemed to catch Blake off guard, if only for a moment. His smug demeanor faltered, his eyes narrowing, but he recovered quickly, his smile returning. Sharper this time. "I see you've done some homework," he said, his tone just shy of condescending. "But this car isn't something you can just read about. It's an experience, one that's exclusive." James's fidgeting became more pronounced. He opened his mouth as if to speak but closed it again when Blake shot him a warning glance. The young salesman's discomfort was almost tangible, his fingers twitching as he clutched a tablet to his chest. The collar of his sweatshirt. Victoria took a step closer to the car, her heels clicking sharply against the tiles. "I don't need a lecture on exclusivity," she said, her voice steady but with a steely undertone. "I'm asking for specifics. Are you capable of providing them, or should I find someone else who can?" Blake's nostrils flared, his composure slipping further. He stepped closer, his posture towering, though Victoria didn't back down. "I'm the owner here," he said, his voice lower now, meant for her ears alone. "And I decide who we do business with." The quiet venom in his words didn't go unnoticed. A few customers had stopped pretending not to listen, their gazes flicking between the two as the tension escalated. James took a small step forward, his expression conflicted. But Blake raised a hand without looking at him, effectively silencing him. "I see," Victoria said after a beat, her tone clipped but calm. "And you've decided based on what exactly? My gender? My skin color? Or do you think I just don't look the part?" Her words were quiet, but they landed like a hammer. The hum of conversation ceased entirely, the silence now deafening. Blake's forced smile disappeared, replaced by a thin, tight line. "That's not what I said," he replied quickly, though his tone betrayed his unease. "We have a reputation to maintain, Ms. Bennett. I'm sure you understand." He grabbed her hands in his own and started moving them back and forth again. Victoria arched an eyebrow. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said, her voice laced with icy precision. "And I think you just confirmed exactly what I suspected." Blake opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, Victoria turned her attention to James, whose face had turned a deep shade of red. "You seem to know your inventory," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Perhaps you can answer my questions?" James froze, his eyes darting nervously to Blake. For a moment, it seemed he might step forward, but Blake's sharp voice cut through the air before he could respond. "It's fine, James," Blake said, his tone clipped and final. "I'll handle this." Victoria's gaze shifted back to Blake, her calm exterior betraying nothing of the anger simmering beneath the surface. "You're not handling it very well," she said simply. Blake's face reddened, his carefully curated composure slipping entirely. His hand twitched at his side as though he wanted to grab something, anything, to reassert control. Finally, he stepped back, his voice rising slightly as he called out, "Security!" Two guards stationed near the entrance straightened, their gazes locking onto Victoria. Blake gestured toward her with a sharp motion. "Escort this woman out," he said, his voice trembling just enough to betray his frustration. Victoria didn't move, her heels planted firmly on the glossy tiles. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm, but carried the weight of unshakable resolve. "I'd like to speak to the owner," she said, repeating her earlier request. Blake stepped closer again, his face mere inches from hers. "You're looking at him," he said through gritted teeth. "And if you don't leave now, I'll call the police." For a moment, the room seemed frozen in time. The onlookers, the cars, the glaring lights. It all faded into the background as Victoria held Blake's gaze, unblinking. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low but firm. "Do it," she said. "Call them." Blake hesitated, his confidence wavering. But then, with a sharp nod, he pulled his phone from his pocket and began dialing. The guards stepped closer, their presence looming as the tension in the room reached a breaking point. All eyes were on Victoria as she stood her ground, her defiance shining as brightly as the car she had come to claim. James stood near the edge of the unfolding confrontation, his hand gripping the edge of the counter as though it might steady him. His eyes darted nervously between Blake and Victoria, his discomfort becoming more visible with every passing moment. The tension was no longer contained. It had spread like wildfire, drawing the attention of nearly everyone in the showroom. Customers paused mid-conversation, their gazes flicking toward the escalating exchange. Whispers, low and cautious, hummed through the air. Victoria straightened her posture, her calm, unwavering demeanor amplifying the weight of her next words. Her voice was measured, each syllable delivered with precision. "Let me be clear," she said, her gaze locked firmly on Blake. "You assume I can't afford this car. Why? Is it because I'm a woman? Or is it because I'm black?" The question hung in the air, sharp and cutting, silencing even the whispers. The tension now felt suffocating, pressing down on everyone in the room. For a moment, Blake said nothing. His smile, thin and brittle, faltered into something colder. A sneer. "We cater to a certain clientele here," Blake replied, his tone slow, deliberate, and unapologetic. "I'm sure you understand." James flinched at the words, his lips parting as though he might object, but he hesitated, the unspoken rules of the workplace holding him back. His foot shifted forward, the smallest movement toward intervention, but Blake raised a hand sharply without even glancing in his direction. "It's fine, James," Blake said with an air of finality. "I'll handle this." James froze, his conflicted expression deepening. His hesitation wasn't lost on Victoria, who briefly turned her eyes toward him, silently acknowledging his struggle. But she didn't need James to intervene. She had her own voice, and she intended to use it. "A certain clientele," she repeated, the words dripping with irony. "Do you mean people who look like you? People who meet your narrow definition of what success should look like?" Blake's jaw tightened, his confidence beginning to crack beneath the weight of her steady defiance. "That's not what I said," he replied, though the defensiveness in his tone betrayed him. "Of course it is," Victoria shot back. "You just don't have the courage to say it outright. But let me tell you something. Your assumptions say more about you than they ever could about me." Her voice didn't rise, but it carried through the room with undeniable power. Some of the onlookers exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others watched intently, as though witnessing a storm brewing. A woman near the back muttered something under her breath, though it wasn't clear whether it was in support of Victoria or Blake. Blake's frustration began to show in the way his shoulders stiffened, his posture becoming more rigid. "Look," he said, his tone now tinged with irritation, "I don't have time for this. If you'd like to leave your contact information, someone will reach out to you later." His eyes narrowed, her calm exterior hardening into something steely. "I'm not leaving my contact information," she said firmly. "I'm standing here right now, and I expect to be treated like any other customer in this showroom." Blake took a step closer, his voice dropping in an attempt to regain control. "This isn't the way we do things here." "And what way is that?" Victoria asked, meeting his gaze without flinching. "The way where you decide who's worthy of being here? The way where you get to humiliate someone for daring to challenge your assumptions?" The conversation was no longer just between them. It had become a spectacle. Each word from Victoria seemed to send ripples through the room, the whispers growing louder and more frequent. James shifted uneasily, his hand now gripping the edge of his tablet so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "I'm asking you, politely, to leave," Blake said through gritted teeth, his tone no longer masking his irritation. Victoria crossed her arms, her expression calm but unyielding. "And I'm telling you, politely, that I'm not leaving. Not until you treat me with the same respect you'd show any other customer." The guards, who had been lingering near the entrance, began to move closer, their eyes fixed on Blake for further instruction. Victoria noticed them but didn't waver. She turned her attention back to Blake, her voice softening but losing none of its sharpness. "This isn't about me wanting a car," she said. "It's about the principle. People like you have been deciding for years who gets to belong in spaces like this. I'm here to tell you that your time is up." Blake's hand twitched, his fingers curling into a fist before quickly releasing. "I don't need a lecture," he snapped, his voice louder now, enough to draw startled glances from the nearest customers. "You can leave on your own, or I'll have security escort you out." The guards were now only a few steps away, their presence looming like shadows over the scene. James took another hesitant step forward, his voice breaking through for the first time. "Mr. Thompson?" "Mr. Thompson?" "I said I'll handle it," Blake barked, cutting him off. James recoiled slightly, his expression clouded with guilt. "Oh." Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "Call them," she said simply. "Call the police. Let's see how far you're willing to take this." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and for the first time Blake hesitated. His arrogance faltered, replaced by something closer to uncertainty, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Not now. Not in front of his staff, his customers, or the woman who had dared to challenge him. With a sharp motion, he reached for his phone, his expression darkening. The guards hovered nearby, waiting for his command. The room was silent now, the air heavy with anticipation, as everyone waited to see how this standoff would end. Victoria remained still, her expression calm and resolute, as if daring the room to look away. The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on Victoria and Blake as the confrontation reached its peak. Blake's face was flushed, his composure teetering on the edge of collapse. With an exaggerated gesture, he turned to the security guards, his tone sharp and final. "I think it's time you left," Blake said, pointing toward Victoria with a stiff hand. "Security, escort her out." The guards hesitated briefly, glancing between Blake and Victoria, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Victoria, unshaken, crossed her arms over her chest, her crimson gown shimmering under the bright showroom lights. Her voice, steady and unyielding, rose just enough to command the room's attention. "I'd like to speak to the owner," she said, her words a challenge as much as a request. Blake took a step forward, his height giving him the illusion of dominance. His voice dropped, cold and deliberate, as he leaned slightly toward her. "You're looking at him, and if you don't leave now, I'll call the police." The air seemed to still, the weight of his threat hanging between them. For a moment, neither moved, their locked gazes the centerpiece of the charged silence. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, Victoria spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Go ahead," she said simply. "Call them." Blake hesitated, his confidence faltering as whispers rippled through the crowd, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. Pulling his phone from his pocket with a flourish, he punched in a number, his movements exaggerated for the benefit of the onlookers. The guards stepped closer, their expressions unreadable, as Blake's voice filled the room. "Yes, this is Blake Thompson, owner of Elite Motors," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "We've got a disruptive individual on the premises. She's refusing to leave and causing a scene. Send someone immediately." The call ended, and Blake slid the phone back into his pocket with a smug expression, his eyes flicking toward Victoria as if daring her to react. But she remained calm, her arms still crossed, her gaze steady. The crowd, though hushed, seemed to shift uneasily as if collectively aware of the gravity of what was about to unfold. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the tense silence, their wailing echoing through the glass walls of the showroom. Customers turned toward the entrance as two uniformed police officers strode inside, their faces set in grim determination. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern expression, approached Blake, who immediately launched into an animated recounting of the situation. "She's causing trouble," Blake said, gesturing toward Victoria with exaggerated indignation. "Refusing to leave, disrupting our business, and frankly, I think she might be trying to pull some kind of scam." The officers turned their attention to Victoria, their gazes flicking over her composed demeanor and elegant attire. For a moment, there was a flicker of doubt in their expressions, but the weight of Blake's accusations seemed to tip the scale. The lead officer stepped forward, addressing Victoria in a tone that was firm but not unkind. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to step outside," he said. Victoria's eyes didn't waver, her voice calm as she responded, "I'm not disrupting anything. I'm here as a customer, and I've done nothing wrong." He said, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," the officer said, his voice softening slightly. Victoria's jaw tightened, the injustice of the moment settling heavily around her, but she didn't resist as the officers moved closer. The cold, metallic snap of handcuffs being fastened around her wrists cut through the room, the sound sending a shiver through the gathered onlookers. Whispers erupted anew, some shocked, others judgmental, as Victoria was led toward the exit. "Pierre suspected à la mamère." As they escorted her out, Blake's voice followed like a venomous hiss. "Next time, know your place," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Victoria didn't look back. Her steps were measured, her chin held high, even as the cuffs bit into her skin. Outside, the flashing lights of the police car illuminated the darkening street. The officers guided her into the back seat, their movements brusque but not rough. Inside the car, Victoria's gaze remained fixed forward. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths as she fought to suppress the frustration and anger threatening to surface. But her eyes, resolute and fierce, betrayed none of the humiliation she felt. As the car pulled away, the distant glow of the dealership faded from view. The image of Blake's smug expression lingered in her mind, but Victoria's focus shifted to something deeper, a determination that burned brighter with every passing second. Her jaw tightened, her fingers curling into fists against the cold metal of the cuffs. This wasn't over. Blake Thompson leaned back in his leather office chair, a self-satisfied smirk plastered across his face. The faint hum of activity from the dealership floor barely reached him through the soundproof glass walls of his corner office. He swirled a glass of scotch in his hand, reveling in what he considered another flawless assertion of his authority. That woman, Victoria Bennett, had been a nuisance, sure, but her removal had been swift, and as far as he was concerned, justified. People like her didn't belong in spaces like this, and he had made that perfectly clear. The buzz of the intercom interrupted his reverie. He frowned slightly, annoyed at the intrusion. His assistant's voice crackled through the speaker, uncharacteristically shaky. He had expected relief. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her tone faltering. "There's a Mr. Bennett here to see you." Blake straightened in his chair, his brow furrowing. "Bennett?" he repeated, more to himself than to her. "Fine, send him in." He set his glass down on the desk, curiosity piqued. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't immediately place it. The door opened a moment later, and his confusion melted into unease. Marcus Bennett strode into the room with the kind of presence that demanded attention. His tailored charcoal suit fit him impeccably, exuding wealth and power. He moved with deliberate precision, every step a calculated act of dominance. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Blake as he approached the desk. In his hand, he carried a sleek black folder. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said, his voice deep and steady, carrying the weight of unshakable authority. "I'm here about the incident involving my mother, Victoria Bennett." The words hit Blake like a thunderclap. Recognition dawned almost immediately, his face paling as the pieces fell into place. He opened his mouth to speak, but Marcus continued before he could form a coherent response. "This," Marcus said, placing the folder on Blake's desk with a measured motion, "is a legal notice for discrimination, false imprisonment, and defamation. We've also filed complaints with state and federal agencies. I trust you understand the gravity of the situation." Blake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The confidence he'd so carefully cultivated was crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of panic. He reached for the folder with trembling hands, flipping it open to reveal the neatly typed documents inside. His eyes skimmed the words: lawsuits, damages, federal investigations, and his throat went dry. "Now, wait a minute," Blake stammered, his voice losing its usual polished veneer. "Surely this can be resolved without dragging lawyers into it. I'm sure we can come to some sort of arrangement." Marcus's lips curled into a smile, sharp and devoid of warmth. "An arrangement?" he repeated, his tone laced with quiet amusement. "Mr. Thompson, this isn't a negotiation." Blake swallowed hard, his mind racing. "Look," he said, leaning forward in a futile attempt to regain control of the conversation. "Maybe I was a little harsh, but we're talking about a misunderstanding here, not a federal case." Marcus didn't so much as blink. "A misunderstanding?" he echoed. "Let me be clear, Mr. Thompson. What you did to my mother wasn't just harsh. It was illegal. And now you're going to face the consequences." Blake opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm, "the consequences have already begun. As of this morning, Bennett Financial Group owns a controlling interest in Luxury Motors International." The words hit Blake like a physical blow. His breath caught, and he leaned back in his chair, as though the force of Marcus's revelation had knocked the air out of him. "What?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus's smile widened, though it remained as cold as ever. "That means," he continued, "you work for me now." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake's eyes darted to the folder in front of him, then back to Marcus, whose calm, unflinching demeanor radiated absolute control. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely, and Blake could feel it suffocating him. "Now," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly, "here's what's going to happen. You're going to step down from your position immediately. A formal apology to my mother will be issued by this dealership, and you will cooperate fully with our legal proceedings. Failure to comply will result in further action. Action that, I assure you, will leave you with nothing." Blake's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. He looked as though he might argue, but the intensity in Marcus's eyes left no room for debate. "You can't do this," Blake said weakly, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. "I already have," Marcus replied simply. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a fluid motion, his confidence unshaken. "I suggest you use the time you have left to reflect on the choices that brought you here." As Marcus turned to leave, Blake found his voice, though it was tinged with desperation. "This isn't over," he called after him. "You can't just ruin me like this." Marcus paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "You ruined yourself," he said, his tone final. Without another word, he stepped out, leaving Blake alone in the suffocating silence of his office. The weight of what had just happened settled heavily on Blake's chest. The scotch on his desk sat untouched, the amber liquid catching the light as if mocking him. For the first time in years, Blake Thompson felt powerless. The fallout was as swift as it was unforgiving, leaving Blake Thompson's once pristine reputation in tatters. News of the incident spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts and investigative reporting that uncovered years of subtle exclusionary practices at Elite Motors. What had begun as one man's arrogance became a reckoning for an entire system. Blake's resignation was announced with a curt press release, a feeble attempt to save face. His dismissal was framed as a mutual decision, but the whispers behind closed doors told a different story. His name was no longer synonymous with luxury and exclusivity. Instead, it became a cautionary tale of unchecked prejudice and hubris. The man who once ruled his showroom like a king now found himself ostracized, his empire reduced to ashes. Meanwhile, Elite Motors itself underwent a transformation. Under new leadership spearheaded by Bennett Financial Group, the dealership announced sweeping changes. Diversity training was made mandatory for all employees, and hiring practices were restructured to prioritize inclusivity. Customers entering the showroom now saw a space that reflected the values of respect and equity, a stark contrast to the elitism that once defined it. Victoria's name was not just whispered in corporate halls, but spoken aloud as a symbol of resilience and change. The story didn't end at the dealership. Victoria Bennett's ordeal struck a chord far beyond the confines of Elite Motors. The Bennett Family Foundation, originally focused on education and entrepreneurship, expanded its mission to include combating systemic bias in corporate culture. Marcus, ever the strategist, used the momentum to amplify their reach, securing partnerships with influential organizations and policymakers. Media outlets lauded Victoria as a trailblazer, but she remained grounded, insisting that her fight wasn't about her alone. It was about dismantling the invisible walls that kept others from stepping into spaces they rightfully deserved. Yet, amid the triumph, there was no gloating. Victoria's victory was laced with bittersweet undertones. One evening, as she prepared for a foundation gala, she stood before a framed photo of her late husband, David, who had been her unwavering partner through decades of challenges. "We've come a long way," she murmured, her reflection in the glass catching the faintest quiver in her smile. But her gaze was resolute. There was still more to do. The dealership became a case study, a lightning rod for conversations about systemic racism, gender bias, and corporate accountability. For every person inspired by the Bennett's triumph, there were others who bristled at the changes, clinging to outdated ideals. The discourse was messy and uncomfortable, but it was necessary, a reminder that true progress often comes with resistance. On a crisp morning months later, Victoria drove past Elite Motors in her newly purchased Aston Martin Vantage. The sleek silver car hummed beneath her fingertips, a symbol not of vengeance but of hard-earned dignity. The showroom gleamed under the sunlight, a facade both familiar and entirely different. She slowed as she passed, her gaze lingering for just a moment. "Justice," she said softly, almost to herself. "It's not just about the fight. It's about what comes after." The car accelerated, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. For the people watching her drive by, it was a simple, fleeting moment. But for Victoria, it was the closing of a chapter, a quiet victory written in the language of change. And as the miles stretched ahead, the road seemed endless, full of possibilities. The question lingered in the air: how many others, inspired by this story, would dare to challenge the walls built to keep them out? It wasn't a question with a neat, immediate answer. It was a challenge for all who heard it, an invitation to consider what justice truly means and what they were willing to do to achieve it. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sleek lines of Victoria's silver Aston Martin Vantage as it glided effortlessly down the highway. The engine purred like a symphony, every vibration a reminder of how far she'd come. The open road stretched ahead, a metaphor for the possibilities that awaited her, unbound by the limits others had tried to impose. As the familiar outline of Elite Motors came into view, she felt a faint tug of memory. The building stood there, its pristine glass facade gleaming as though nothing had ever happened, as though it hadn't been the stage for a battle she hadn't sought but couldn't avoid. Yet, beneath the surface, everything had changed. The toxic culture that had once festered inside was being dismantled piece by piece, replaced by something better, something fairer. Victoria slowed her car as she approached, her gaze catching the dealership in the rearview mirror as it began to fade into the distance. For a moment, her reflection lingered there, a quiet yet powerful symbol of what it meant to stand firm in the face of injustice. "Sometimes the best revenge is simply justice," she murmured to herself, her voice calm but resonant, as though speaking not just to the present, but to the woman she had been. The woman who had walked into that showroom weeks ago with the same dignity she carried now. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the ripples her story had created. It wasn't just about a car or a single dealership. It was about challenging a narrative that had persisted for far too long. She had refused to shrink herself to fit someone else's narrow definition of worth. And in doing so, she had carved a path for others to follow. With a deep breath, she pressed lightly on the accelerator, the hum of the engine rising as the miles stretched before her. The open road felt like freedom, but also a reminder that there was more to do. Progress was never a straight line. It was a winding journey, one that demanded persistence and resolve. Behind her, the dealership disappeared entirely, swallowed by the horizon. Victoria smiled, not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction. This was a victory she wouldn't need to shout about. It spoke for itself. The weight of the past week lifted slightly as she focused on the road ahead, her hands steady on the wheel. The future was hers now, hers to shape, hers to share. And in that moment, surrounded by the vastness of possibility, she felt not just victorious, but free. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the sleek lines of Victoria's silver Aston Martin Vantage as it glided effortlessly down the highway. The engine purred like a symphony, every vibration a reminder of how far she'd come. The open road stretched ahead, a metaphor for the possibilities that awaited her, unbound by the limits others had tried to impose. As the familiar outline of Elite Motors came into view, she felt a faint tug of memory. The building stood there, its pristine glass facade gleaming as though nothing had ever happened, as though it hadn't been the stage for a battle she hadn't sought but couldn't avoid. Yet beneath the surface, everything had changed. The toxic culture that had once festered inside was being dismantled piece by piece, replaced by something better, something fairer. Victoria slowed her car as she approached, her gaze catching the dealership in the rearview mirror as it began to fade into the distance. For a moment, her reflection lingered there, a quiet yet powerful symbol of what it meant to stand firm in the face of injustice. "Sometimes the best revenge is simply justice," she murmured to herself, her voice calm but resonant, as though speaking not just to the present, but to the woman she had been, the woman who had walked into that showroom weeks ago with the same dignity she carried now. Her thoughts wandered briefly to the ripples her story had created. It wasn't just about a car or a single dealership. It was about challenging a narrative that had persisted for far too long. She had refused to shrink herself to fit someone else's narrow definition of worth, and in doing so, she had carved a path for others to follow. With a deep breath, she pressed lightly on the accelerator, the hum of the engine rising as the miles stretched before her. The open road felt like freedom, but also a reminder that there was more to do. Progress was never a straight line. It was a winding journey, one that demanded persistence and resolve. Behind her, the dealership disappeared entirely, swallowed by the horizon. Victoria smiled, not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction. This was a victory she wouldn't need to shout about. It spoke for itself. The weight of the past week lifted slightly as she focused on the road ahead, her hands steady on the wheel. The future was hers now, hers to shape, hers to share. And in that moment, surrounded by the vastness of possibility, she felt not just victorious, but free.